I wanted to go over everything that you guys have been asking me about different things on the Bible. Why are there different translations? What's the difference between the translations, stuff like that. So we're going to jump into it because I brought you a lot of Bibles.
All right, let's see it.
So in this box, we have a nice, good King James Bible. I have the LSB Bible. This is my favorite Bible. To answer that quickly, immediately, this is the most accurate English translation. This is a word-for-word translation, okay? So there's a distinction between a thought-for-thought and a word-for-word translation. LSB, one of the most accurate, if not the most accurate to this day.
I don't think I would agree with this. I think the Legacy Standard Bible does an admirable job in a lot of ways, improving upon the translations that have come before it. For instance, translating the Greek doulos as slave rather than as servant. But like many of the translations that came before it, it still sometimes sacrifices accuracy to dogmatism, and specifically the dogma of univocality. And as just one example, like the ESV and the NIV before it, the LSB falsely translates the vayikol preterite verb at the beginning of Genesis 2:19, vayitzer, as a pluperfect. And this is done entirely to dodge the contradiction with the creation account in Genesis 1. Because in Genesis 1, humanity is created after the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. But in Genesis 2, humanity is created, and then in verse 19 it says, "Then Adonai God formed from the ground every beast of the field and bird of the sky." But if you translate it as a pluperfect, you get, "And Adonai God had formed out of the ground every beast of the field and bird of the sky," which makes it sound like this happened before the creation of humanity. And there is absolutely no case to make that the vayikol that begins that verse is intended as a pluperfect. That is not how you form the pluperfect in biblical Hebrew. You interrupt the past time narrative sequence by returning to a katal verb form, as it does at the end of Genesis 2:8. So that is an example of dogmatism overruling accuracy in the LSB.
And you have wonderful things like this. This is a chronological Bible. This helps you to just kind of like analyze things in chronological order so that you can play with it and kind of go from there and check things out. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Chronological Bible is awesome. That one is specifically in the New King James Version.
That looks like this NKJV Chronological Bible in 1 year, which basically is a reading plan that lets you read for 15 minutes or so a day and get through the entire Bible. However, it presupposes the inerrancy and the historicity of the biblical accounts, as well as the traditions about their authorship. And so it will falsely attribute the Psalms to David. It will falsely attribute the Proverbs to Solomon. It will falsely date a lot of much later writings to much earlier periods. So you're getting a traditional chronology rather than what the data indicate.
Then I have myself a nice, beautiful Geneva Bible. This is the 1599 Geneva Bible. It is beautiful. It is hard to read because the words are spelt differently than now, but Geneva Bibles are awesome. This is basically exactly what the King James Bible is based on. So whenever people are like, King James Bible is the best Bible, you just have an upgraded Geneva. That's all it is.
This is not accurate. The King James Version is a very conservative revision of the Bishop's Bible itself, first published in 1568. And the Bishop's Bible is not a revision of the Geneva Bible. It is a revision of the 1539 Great Bible. And while the translators of the Bishop's Bible did refer to the Geneva Bible in the process of translation, the King James Version is much closer to the Bishop's Bible and the Great Bible than it is to the Geneva Bible.
The Geneva Bible was the first one to actually separate everything by chapters and by verses.
To be a bit more accurate, the Geneva Bible is the first printed English Bible that includes full versification. The Hebrew Bible had been divided into verses over a century prior by a Rabbi Isaac Nathan ben Kalonymus, but that was not in printed Bibles. In 1551, a scholar named Robertus Stephanos produced his own edition of the Textus Receptus that divided the New Testament into verses, and then he produced a Latin Vulgate the same year that provided versification throughout. And then the Geneva Bible in 1560 became the first English printed Bible to include versification throughout the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament.
Got myself a copy of a Tyndale New Testament. It is absolutely awesome. This was translated in 1536, and it has some like super duper funky way of talking in a lot of it just because it is extremely old English. Sometimes this is very hard to read, and primarily this is so old that it doesn't even have Jesus in there. If you can see that, I'm not sure if you can, where it still says Jesus. That's pretty cool. This has a lot of cool stuff. I've bounced back to this one a lot just to kind of check on certain things, certain translations, because it's a really cool thing. So, Tyndale Bible, awesome.
I would highly recommend getting a hold of one of Tyndale's editions of the New Testament in English. He published his first edition in 1526. This is a wonderful facsimile edition of that. He published a revision in 1534, and then the 1536 edition was published posthumously by others who edited his work for him.
In one of the worst Bibles out there, this is an NIV. I do not like the NIV.
I am also not a huge fan of the NIV, but probably for very different reasons.
But now, why are there different translations of the Bible? Why is it done so many different times?
Well, in addition to the fact that languages change, Bible translations serve the interests of their audiences, and we have a lot of different audiences looking for Bible translations that are going to do a lot of different things. So there is always a need for something to change with a Bible translation.
And really the simple answer is because English is one of the most rapidly evolving languages that has ever existed.
While language change is certainly a factor in the proliferation of English translations of the Bible, I think globalization and diversity is just as much a factor, and the market is also just as much a factor. And the notion that English is the most rapidly evolving language of all time is not accurate. There are languages that have evolved much more rapidly, for instance, Creoles and Pidgins, as well as languages that have been revitalized, like Guarani and Maori and Navajo and modern Hebrew and languages like that. There is much more rapid change as entire lexicons are developed within a single generation in those languages.
Now, primarily, there are two different kinds of translations that you'll have. You'll have one that is based on something called the Codex, and you'll have something based on something called the Textus Receptus. That means the received text. So the Geneva Bible, the King James Version, these ones are based on the Textus Receptus. Same with the New King James. They are translated from the received text, which is essentially this collection of texts. And then the Codex translations, things like the LSB or the NASB or even the NLT and NIV, they're based on the Codex.
So this is not very accurate. No scholars talk about the Codex as a type of source text, unless they're talking about a translation based on a diplomatic edition of a specific codex, like Codex Sinaiticus or something like that. The translations that were mentioned by this content creator, however, are based on a critical text or a critical edition. And this is an eclectic edition of the Greek New Testament, just like the Textus Receptus. But whereas the Textus Receptus was developed in the 16th and 17th centuries based on a rather limited number of mostly very late manuscripts, the critical text developed in the 18th and 19th centuries as we discovered a lot more manuscripts and the text critical discipline matured, and we were able to make more careful decisions about which readings took priority. And so in the 19th century, scholars began to produce new eclectic editions of the Greek New Testament, and this was very controversial, but the translations mentioned by this content creator were based on the critical text rather than the Textus Receptus, but both are eclectic versions of the Greek New Testament,
which is even older copies of manuscripts. And a lot of those are really cool because there's cool history behind where people hid these different manuscripts. They hid them in caves and everything, and then we found them and then we translated them. But the problem that we come into with that is that most of these copies, most of these manuscripts are literally things where people went into their church, they were reading the letter, and then they copied it down on their own piece of paper, and then they brought it home. So in some cases, those people who are not professionals for copying it or anything like that, they just copied it for themselves for their own personal benefits, and then those were hidden and then later found by us and used to translate.
That is not a common mode of transmission for biblical manuscripts, and that's certainly not how we got the critical text.
So in some of those cases, they might have accidentally skipped a line, and so you'll see different verses in books like this that may or may not be omitted that exist within the Textus Receptus.
So I think I see where this is going. This sounds like a rather naive attempt to try to rationalize why the critical text omits more than a dozen different passages from the New Testament that are found in the Textus Receptus. The idea is that the critical text is based on a lot of manuscripts that were hurriedly copied for personal use and omitted passages that were in their sources, and that's not supported by any data whatsoever. The critical text omits more than a dozen passages that are found in the Textus Receptus because the critical text is based on older, more reliable manuscripts, and we know that those dozen plus passages were not a part of the New Testament originally, but were added in later, making the Textus Receptus a less reliable eclectic edition of the Greek New Testament.
Does that mean that this is kicking them out? No, because anytime that one of these Bibles doesn't have it included in that lineage, it's going to have it down in the footnotes, and it's going to say that it's supposed to be there or that it was there. It's just not there in the specific document that they translated it off of.
This is entirely inaccurate when newer editions of the Bible omit passages from the main body of text but include them in the footnotes. Usually they will either say some ancient authorities include, and then they will quote the passage, or they will say some later manuscripts include, and then they will quote the passage. I'm not aware of any that say this should be there or this was there. They're being omitted because the editors, and usually the editors of the critical source text rather than the editors of the translation itself, recognize that that passage was a later addition to the text rather than something that was original. So they're trying to represent in the main body of text the text as we think it was originally constituted, and that means sometimes removing passages that are widely recognized as secondary additions to the text.
So to give you a direct comparison real quick, we're going to go King James and we're going to go LSB. We're going to go to Acts 8. We're going to go to verse 36, 37. This is where Philip is traveling with a eunuch. Okay? Now, verse 37 there, which gives you that very specific requirement that if you believe with all your heart, then you may. Then the eunuch responds and says, I do believe with all my heart that Jesus is God.
I think you mean the Son of God.
That is absent from certain Bibles. So if we go into the LSB, the Legacy Standard Bible, boom, so verse 36 in the LSB. And they went along the road and came to some water, and the eunuch said, look, water, what prevents me from being baptized? Then, so you see right there, it has it in brackets at verse 37. They put it in brackets. Why? Because it was not in the specific manuscript that this was copied from. But it says, and it's still included here.
That is entirely inaccurate. It is in brackets because scholars are in widespread agreement that it was not written by the author of Acts and that it is a secondary addition to the text of Acts. Now, most contemporary Bible translations will relegate these passages to the footnotes, but this particular translation is obviously scared of its readership because they know they will not understand and they will not accept that we have a better version of the New Testament today than the one that was cobbled together in the 16th century. And so they put it in the main body of text, and it results in misunderstandings like the one being promulgated by this content creator. But if you ever run across things like this and you wonder why a passage might be bracketed or omitted, a wonderful resource is Bruce Metzger's textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, which goes through passage by passage explaining why certain things are omitted. Here is the beginning of the discussion about this particular passage, and the editorial decision there is omit verse. As you can see, verse 37 is a Western addition, not found in P45 or 74 or Sinaiticus or Alexandrinus or Vaticanus or Ephraemi Rescriptus or several other manuscripts, but read with many minor variations by E, many minuscules. And then the editor goes on to explain there is no reason why scribes should have omitted the material if it had originally stood in the text. It should be noted, too, that ton Iesun Christon is not a Lucan expression. The formula pistevo Christon was doubtless used by the early church in baptismal ceremonies and may have been written in the margin of a copy of Acts. Its insertion into the text seems to have been due to the feeling that Philip could not have baptized the Ethiopian without securing a confession of faith which needed to be expressed in the narrative. Although the earliest known New Testament manuscript which contains the words dates from the 6th century, manuscript E, the tradition of the Ethiopians' confession of faith in Christ was current as early as the latter part of the 2nd century, for Irenaeus quotes part of it in Against Heresies.
However, you'll look into things like the NIV. Let's open this girl up to Acts real quick. And so going into the NIV, we have it right here. As they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, look, here's water. Why shouldn't I be baptized? And then it immediately skips to verse 38. Doesn't have anything with the 37. It immediately goes from 36 to 38. And it just picks up in verse 38 right there and says, and he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. So they completely exclude it right there, until you go to the footnotes at the bottom, and then down here it says some later manuscripts, and it has verse 37 written out plainly right there. If you believe with all your heart, you may. The eunuch answered, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So you see that in here. It still includes it, but it removes it from up here.
And this just means that, at least for that passage, the NIV is closer to the original version of the book of Acts than the LSB.
So regardless of what Bible you choose, it really doesn't make much of a difference. You just need to make sure that you're reading a legitimate translation.
But if you're going to pontificate about Bible translations, you should have a rudimentary grasp of what you're talking about.
So like the New World Translation that the Jehovah's Witnesses use, or the Joseph Smith translation that the Mormons tend to use, that not anymore, they used to, now they just stick with the King James.
This is inaccurate. The Joseph Smith translation has never taken priority over the King James Version for Latter-day Saints. The King James Version has always been the official, the recommended, the authorized English translation of the Bible for Latter-day Saints. And up until the late 1970s, Latter-day Saints actually did not trust the Joseph Smith translation because they believed that the RLDS Church, now known as the Community of Christ, who has always been in possession of the Joseph Smith translation up until last year, had altered the manuscripts. And so it wasn't until Robert J. Matthews in the 70s did a bunch of research on the manuscripts that Latter-day Saints began to trust it. And so in the 1980 and 81 editions of the Scriptures, Latter-day Saints began including readings from the JST in the footnotes. But the JST has never taken priority over the King James Version as the official English translation of the Bible for Latter-day Saints. And if you would like more information on Latter-day Saints and Bible translation, I have published a paper on this topic that is freely available through a link in my link tree.
But the most accurate word-for-word translation that we have in English today is the LSB, the Legacy Standard Bible.
Yeah, that is not accurate. If you're looking for the most scholarly, the most up-to-date, the most accurate translation of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament together, I would recommend the updated edition of the New Revised Standard Version. And in terms of study Bibles, the SBL Study Bible is currently the one that I would recommend. The 6th edition of the New Oxford Annotated Bible should come out shortly, and I will probably shift allegiances to that, but for the time being, I like the SBL Study Bible. There's also a new Westminster Study Bible that also incorporates the updated edition of the New Revised Standard Version. And the fit for this video has been undiagnosed, but something ain't right.